Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as usual by Tucker Hazel, and we're here today to tackle another ephemeral topic. This time, does good game design even exist? But before we do, if you want to share your thoughts with us about the topic, be sure to join our Discord, link as usual, top of the description or down there. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, leave a comment. Give your high-level thoughts in the comments, then come to the Discord and take the conversation further. Because I want to talk to you in
Yes.
the Discord.
Argue with
I'm
us.
always stalking the Discord. I'm
Yeah.
never checking the comments. But the comments help us in the algorithm, so do both.
Perfect.
But
Yes.
Talker, let's talk about the topic. Don't you agree?
Absolutely.
Tucker, this is
Yeah.
something you're, I think, very passionate about because you're a
Yeah.
thinking man's man. I'm always thinking about
Oh.
game design, but not in the same
Mhm.
way that you are necessarily, because you're always thinking about putting games into this overarching conversation of what is good game design? And you bring this conversation up to me
Mhm.
in a lot of different times, and Metroid Prime
Yeah.
Remastered being probably the most recent flashpoint of the topic. But I basically
Yes.
just want to cede the floor to you to begin, however and wherever you want to.
Yeah. Well, so part of what I find interesting about talking about games and talking about games with people that have very different opinions than I do, and me holding different opinions from what a lot of other people do, is that there are a lot of elements that I think people take for
Sure.
granted as an element of their thoughts about games or the culture about games, the discussion about games, that I don't know are as inherently true as sometimes the conversation might present it as. Of like, hey, Super Mario World is one of the greatest games of all time. It's the tight controls, the overworld map, all these elements that were so innovative at the time, and yeah, they still do hold up. But those are taken for granted. Like, of course, factually true. But I do think that there are elements, and we're not necessarily going to focus on Super Mario World here. That's just
Right.
a one-off example of games that are seen as some of the greats that I think do have some flaws if you come at it from a different angle, or games that maybe don't aren't as critically acclaimed, aren't held in that super high regard, that I think have some elements that if you're coming at it from a different angle, you can appreciate for what the game is doing on its own level, which is, of course, just a general thing about reviewing of your perspective and how that is going to shape the way that you are enjoying
Yeah.
a game or not. But I find myself thinking about this often when I present a critique or a praise of a game, and people are like, no, you're wrong about that on either way, or I'm saying no, you're wrong about that to someone else, and I try to divorce myself from this like internal mindset of is that even is that possible
Sure.
to say? Is it accurate to say that you are wrong for appreciating something or disliking something? Because elements of the general consensus can be taken for granted, and people are like, no, yeah, of course this is true, but is it? Is the question that I sort of worm my way into people's minds and make them question their very
Well, yeah,
foundations
this
of
is why I think
existence.
it's an interesting conversation because, as I was so ineloquently trying to explain before, you are very much concerned, and I don't mean that. I mean concerned in the sense that you just care a lot about it. You're concerned about
I'm concerned.
figuring out this
I'm
larger.
worried. I'm
Yeah,
a fearful.
I'm fearful of you. You're very much concerned about figuring out this larger idea of like good game design. And
Hmm.
while I think about game design often, I basically never think about it in those terms because
Mm.
the objective gamer's guide to good design doesn't really
Yeah.
exist in my opinion. It's very
Yeah. No.
title by title. I think I for me
Mm.
good game design doesn't really extend beyond the boundaries of any particular game because
Hmm.
games are developed with so many different intents and your game design needs
Yeah.
to match your intent, and we can get into this in a more
Hmm.
specific way, but I think there's kind of two components when we answer this question. For me, the first one is, well, you really got to talk about game design as it relates to the what the title's trying to accomplish, and then maybe how it
Hmm.
relates to the titles around it. Maybe it's in its genre or in its series or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the
Mm.
other part of it is that, and we will put this out there right from the start. What you think good game design is, and what I think good game design is, being speaking in a generalized sense, are completely different on a subjective level. We both
Yes,
like
they
very
are.
different things
Yes,
out of our
absolutely.
games. So I think these are going to be sort of interesting things to navigate. But before we even touch on that subjective side more, what do you think about my idea that game design is good or bad in a very local sense. I don't really think there's any global definition of good design.
No, I absolutely agree, and actually, that's the lens that I want to shape this through. Is maybe focusing in on a few games with elements that you and I disagree on, sort of defining why that particular element of that game is good or bad. And I agree that it is on a title by title basis, and I find myself thinking about it on that title by title basis once that is introduced in conversation with other people, when it's presented as this is good or this is bad, or I dislike this, I enjoy this. And I try to answer in my mind what elements of someone's experience with games, their what they value in different kinds of games would lead them to making this claim, whether it's positive or negative. And same on my own internal side. Why am I making a claim that I did on the Discord a few weeks ago of Castlevania not being a very well-designed game, and our friend Bro being able to very eloquently say, no, it is well-designed for these reasons. And I struggle to like divorce
Right.
myself completely from it. It's not possible. When I'm talking about my thoughts on the game, I can present things as this is good or this is bad, but of course I know in reality that it's like, yeah, I'm informed by who I am, and there's no way to escape that. But the idea of something being well designed or not, I think, can be like sort of polished down to the core of being the feel of interactivity, the harmony with other game design elements around it. But there are still people, and there's plenty of popular high acclaimed games that I dislike. There's plenty of popular high acclaimed games that you dislike. These elements aren't universal, which is why I question the idea that a game can be inherently well designed, because I think there's so much subjectivity involved in what you value, what you enjoy, what genre types you personally like, that form your thoughts on a game even being well designed at its very core.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been thinking of this game that, in my opinion, still is not real. Crime Boss Rock City.
Jesus, that did come out.
Okay. You look at games like that review badly, and you start to really contextualize the number of games that do review badly, and you start to bring into conversation this idea that people have of why it's a reductive idea, but why does IGN give everything a 7 or above? Why why aren't these scales sort of explored more across sites or whatever? Everything is good. Well, because I think that there is a sort of baseline inherent goodness to a lot of games, and then it makes it remarkable when a game like Crime Boss comes out and just isn't, right? I mean, you think about the bad games, you can point out games that are bad from recent memory far more easily than you can the games that are good, because for every time that a game like Gotham Knight comes out, or what's it called, Gotham Knights comes out, and like everybody is shitting on it, that's like a moment. We remember those titles because even a game like Modern Warfare 2, which I have ideological and mechanical issues with, it's good. Like, there's a baseline goodness to Call of Duty, right? And so when you think about game design, you hit some really objective pillars. Is the AI fucked up?
Yeah.
Are the textures loading right? Are various things like that. I mean, there are very clear yes, no, good, bad. But then it very quickly gets into subjectivity, because I've got behind me Resident Evil 4 Remake. And so we've been talking recently about Resident Evil 4 Original. And when I was saying, is the AI good, is the textures load, I almost said, does it control well? But even as soon as you start speaking about controls, there's a great degree of subjectivity to bring to the conversation. In that, I think Resident Evil 4, the original, controls very well. Because the goal of Resident Evil 4 is not to make Leon move smoothly, it's to make the player have enough friction with mechanics so you feel scared. So by that lens, I like that intent, I like the execution, the controls are good. But it's just sort of emblematic to me of the fact that because you need to hold that controller and you need to play the game, any objectivity in design very quickly flies out the window. Here's objectivity.
Yes, absolutely.
How many modes does the game have? What frame rate does it run at? What's the resolution?
Yes.
Those are objective points. You very quickly reach a point where every other facet of game design is more about whether or not you jive with the intent, and then if the intent is well executed.
Yes. Absolutely. And that is, I think, the element that is core to the quote unquote objectivity of the larger scale narrative that people do take for granted. Is enough people consider something well designed, and so yeah, in general, people consider that thing, to whatever it is, to be
Yeah.
well designed. But I do think that when it comes to the subjectivity of it, something like a game that I played recently, Resident Evil 1. I played Resident Evil Remake, which is a remake of a PS1 game on the GameCube that has been ported to everything else and upscaled a little bit. That game, at its bones, is still a very early
Right.
3D game. It's a horror game from when the horror genre barely even existed, and Resident Evil was the pioneer of these things. And part of my struggle playing that game was the controls and the fixed camera angles, these elements of game design of the time that I can 100% understand the arguments for how they are immersive, how they increase the tension, how elements like having the save ribbon, you requiring a save ribbon in order to save, and that has to be something you're holding in your inventory. I can understand why these elements of this game were influential and worked very well for the time, but even though those elements are well designed for a game of the era within these contexts, I do think that there is, and from my perspective, this makes this game significantly worse than the other Resident Evil games that I've played. Those elements, I think, can be seen as poorly designed if you're experiencing the game from a
Yeah.
different angle. I went back to that game after having played Resident Evil 4 and Village and 2 and 7, and having fixed camera angles made me feel like this place was the Spencer Mansion, which is a great location, was fake. It was uninteresting because it was a bunch of still images, ostensibly, that I was walking around, and I didn't feel like I could cohesively explore this location. It really broke my immersion. And that's the exact opposite of what people praise that game's designed for. It's so immersive, and the tank controls and the fixed camera angles make you feel like you're really unsettled in this, and you can like really narrow in on all the details because the camera's in this one fixed perspective. But I don't think that is inherently true for that game, because when I was playing that game, those elements completely took away from my engagement in the game. And I think that is valid if you're coming at it from a different perspective, which is something that you don't see a lot of people my age that started with these other games going back to those titles. So the narrative around it is largely this is well designed because it was innovative for the time. And that is where a lot of my qualms come in, is a lot of games that are older and I perceive as not holding up so well. I try to knock some hold in them and say, hey, maybe this didn't hold up so well. Maybe this could be improved. And maybe that does mean that this game needs to be reevaluated, not considered one of the greats of all time. But again, something very, very subjective. And if there are other specific examples that you want to narrow in on, I think that might be able to catalyze what we're saying here.
When listening to you talk about this, to me, it sounds more like you dislike the intent of Resident Evil than the execution of the design. And here's why I'd say that. Because
Sure. Okay.
Everything about Resident Evil 1, now I've only played the GameCube version, which is even less modernized than the version you played. Everything about that game is very meticulously designed. Every camera angle in Resident Evil is established first through the contextualization of the fact that to make the Spencer Mansion on PS1 so compelling and visually engrossing, we needed to control the environments. And that's rendering techniques used at the time. So every angle was chosen very deliberately to elicit a sense of place, or to hide a scare, or facilitate a puzzle.
True.
That's very, 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 very meticulous design to a level that in a 3D space you can't even control to the same degree. I mean, think about the number of times you play an open world game and I put the camera somewhere it's not supposed to be. You literally can't even do that in Resident Evil 1 because Capcom had such a distinct vision executed on. So for the intent, for the time, it directly addresses what it wanted to do and does that very, very well.
True. 100%.
That's, in my opinion, the issue you're describing is more an issue with the goal they set out to fulfill. And for me, it's very similar to how I feel about Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead Redemption 2 is designed to be heavy on simulation and narrative. To that end, it is very well designed. For me, when I say I take umbrage with the design of the game, what I'm really saying, if I'm being more precise, is that I don't like the design that they were trying to accomplish. I don't like that
Yeah.
Rockstar chose to set out and make a game that is 60 to 80 hours long, wherein I have to shave Arthur Morgan and I have to complete missions in a set way. That's what I don't like. I
Yeah.
don't. It's not that I don't like the execution of it necessarily, or I don't because I don't like the
Mm.
concept.
Hmm.
And that's sort of the point
Yeah.
of distinction I'd want to draw and bring in this third
I think
category
it's totally true.
of
Yeah.
good design, bad design, and then design you can appreciate. Because I can appreciate
Yeah.
Red Dead Redemption 2's design because it reaches its goals very nobly. I just don't like the goal.
Yeah.
But then you can also look back at something like Mario 64. The camera in that game playing now is not good, but it is
Hmm.
incredible design to say people don't understand what a camera is. Let's make Lakitu the camera and let's make the camera a character. That's design I really,
Yeah.
really greatly appreciate because again, they had a goal of saying
Mm.
we're one of the first marquee 3D adventure titles. Let's
Yeah.
find a way to make the camera intuitive and understandable to people, and they did through Lakitu.
Hmm.
And so I think we need to also think about what don't we like. Do we not like the execution of
Yeah.
a mechanic, or do we not like the fact
Hmm.
that the mechanic is there in the first place? And if it's that, I think it speaks something larger
Hmm.
than something being good or bad.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I wonder if giving it that separate label kind of dilutes the criticism slash the praise of something like that of Red Dead Redemption 2 being intentionally designed.
Yeah.
Not a game that I've played, not a game I have any experience with, but continuing the metaphor that or
Yeah.
the reference that you were making, that game I think can be seen and is seen as one of the great games of that kind of design intent, but it not working for you in it the way that it's designed with being very slow paced and very meticulous and needing to do a bunch of mundane things, I think that is an element of the game's design that if things had been changed, you could be more
Yeah.
engaged with. And of course, that's the difference between intent where it gets a little bit muddy is if you disagree with the intent rather than the design, does that still make it well designed even though you didn't
I think so.
enjoy it? Where does that line become drawn? Because I sometimes find it difficult to justify my own criticisms of games that I don't like because I do come at them from the angle of I want to respect this. I want to understand, even though if it's not a game that I love, why they made these choices. But then that for me kind of waters down criticism a little bit. And this is the problem that I have of like trying to say like, oh, it's it's all about perspective, and that really waters things down. Absolutely. But saying something is good or bad in this context, the one of the elements of the last few years that referencing another modern game that has catalyzed sort of this distinction in my mind is a game that you and I reviewed about a year ago, which was Pokemon Legends
Sure.
Arceus, a game that I really enjoyed and a game that you didn't appreciate as much and didn't enjoy. And there are elements of that game's design that I would consider to be very well designed, very cohesive for the world and the atmosphere and the pacing that this game is going for that you disagree with. And I wonder, for your distinction between intent and design, is that a game that you understand the intent of or disagree with the intent of, or do you think that it is poorly designed?
I love the intent of the game. I do think it's poorly designed. And I'll give a very specific example to this end that I think is going to kind of highlight the differences of what we're saying here. The intention of Legends Arceus, in my opinion, and I think you'd agree with this, is to take Pokemon into a new mode wherein it's more about the relationships you have with the Pokemon and the environments they're in and catching and all of these various things. It's about refocusing the intent of the Pokemon series and making this environment feel more like a living, breathing place. Well, the reason one of the issues I have with the game is the fact that catching Pokemon is so simple, and you don't have to like use baits really ever, and you can just throw down like a smoke bomb, and the Pokemon just gets confused, and you walk up behind it and check how heavy ball it's back. Right? That's reductive, but the point being,
yes, of course,
I found a lot of the mechanical implementations of things like bait and traps that make the world feel more alive to the game's intent to be dissatisfying. So I think the execution of that was poor. I actually, to the contrary, I love the idea of making the Pokemon series feel more alive in this way and be more about catching Pokemon and finding them in environments.
Yeah.
But I think that the way that they executed on that intent was very artificial. So that's a clear example for me of
Sure.
where I love the intent. I think it was poorly executed on.
Yeah, so another element of that game that we also really talked about, because I agree with you to a certain extent. If I was to levy criticisms at that game, which is, I think, one of the best Pokemon games, one of the best games of last year, of course, that is something that we disagree on, but that would be something about, yeah, I can concede that. The experience that I had with that element of the game is pretty much null and void because I'm like, sure, okay, whatever, I'm still having fun elsewhere. Does it really matter to the experience if this element is underbaked? But the element that you and I drew the most friction on, that I think I would like to focus this conversation on design, is in the
Yeah.
combat of the game. An element that was not as much changed as the flow of the game from previous Pokemon games, but that was significantly changed for the structure that the game is going for, which is Pokemon moves hit a lot harder. There aren't held items. There aren't abilities in the same way. There isn't as much tactical variety in the game because they completely changed the
Yeah.
combat system. You've got the light and heavy attacks or fast and heavy attacks, whatever it is. And that element of the game, I felt, I would concede, is well designed for the game's intent of keeping you moving forward, having the world feel more dangerous because your Pokemon hit harder, but everything else also hits harder. The speed of it, keeping you having forward momentum and matching the speed of catching something. But you drew umbrage with the combat's design because it was opposite of what Pokemon had been so good at in your eyes for the rest of the series, is having this balance between complexity and simplicity. Though does that make sense for an element of design that we disagree on that I think does feed into the game's intent in a similar way, but where we obviously do draw quite a stark distinction.
I think at a certain point you're just trying to get me to talk about fucking Pokemon again, which I'll fight tooth and nail and never have to do. Because, and I'm being humorous a little bit. I'm not trying to. All I'm trying to say is it's. I think you're making the same point as was the point I made before.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mind the idea that they said our intent is to disincentivize battling. That's fine. My problem is they did it by removing all nuance. When I think we even said in that discussion, you could have done something entirely different. You could have just done auto battling, or you could have just had direct control over your Pokemon, or change up the battle system entirely. Again, that's an executional mistake, in my opinion, of saying, we're just going to give you Pokemon battling, but we're just going to strip it of all of its shit. You can't use held items, you can't have abilities, status moves kind of either don't work the same or aren't useful.
They did,
so like
changed. Yeah.
Again, that's the execution of the idea that I take issue with. It's no different than the other thing. But let me spring the conversation in this direction a little bit, because I think you can also have bad intent and bad design.
I'm sure that is
which
possible,
I think is what you're trying to lead me towards a little bit more in the battle instance. But I think a much more salient example is Star Fox Zero. Star Fox Zero.
Not a game I have any experience with, even though it's sitting back there somewhere.
In Star Fox Zero, it was a bad idea to say, hey, we're gonna make a Star Fox game where you have to use two screens. That is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Their intent was wrong from the beginning. It was not a game that needed to use a gamepad. And then on the execution level, they double fucked it up because there's sequences wherein like you have to jump between them, and it's very awkward, and it's contradicting how you use those mechanics in other ways. You can have a bad idea executed badly. You can also have a bad idea executed well.
Sure. Do you have an example of that?
Yes, Vampire Survivors. I think Vampire Survivors is an excellent example, because Vampire Survivors is 100% built on the tenets of gambling. That's how Vampire Survivors works. It's on dopamine hit of I want the next thing, and the loot and the gold and the fast what's the word for like instant gratification? That's what it is. That's what I was looking for. It's not a good idea to build your game in a intentionally addictive, gambling adjacent way. But the game is so cheap, and it's not asking for more money out of you, and it is very intuitive and engaging and satisfying. So to me, that's a great example of the intent's not awesome, because you're basically just trying to leverage how gambling works. But in execution, you did a really nice job of circumventing the issues with the structure. So I really just think, because you're saying that maybe it dilutes criticism, I disagree. I think criticism is best with the more nuance you add into the conversation. and the more precision
Sure.
you're able,
Yeah. Unlike
right,
Legends Arceus.
the more precision you're able to bring to conversation, and the more you're able to split things apart and identify, do I
Sure.
not like the execution of an idea, or do I not like the idea? Why?
Mm.
Where does the objective element
Yeah.
come in? Where does the subjective element come in? I'm always trying to dig
Mm-hmm.
as deep as possible, I think. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And that's why I like having these kind of conversations, and why, frankly, I drive
You
myself
do.
crazy sometimes thinking about things on such a granular level that I split my
Yeah.
own brain atoms. But I do think that it's fascinating to talk about intent versus design, because you are adding a layer of nuance to my own thought process here that I think clarifies some of the disagreements that we've had over the years
Yeah.
on plenty of games. Of intent, I think, is where a lot of the time our
100%.
disagreements come from. Games that I love for their structure, for their pacing, for their tone, for their style, that is something that appeals to me because I really agree with the intent appeals to me. The intent of a game like Marvel's Guardians of
Sure.
the Galaxy, a game that the intent of that was to bond you to these characters, to have it be a little more slow paced, more focused on that story, and certainly not on
Yep.
the combat, even though that is a present element of that game. But your disagreement with the intent of that game was you wanted it to be more action focused and therefore a little more mechanically engaging. That I'm trying to think of more examples of games maybe that
You think, I'll throw out another one that I think
like.
that
Okay, perfect.
exemplifies this point. I don't really like 2018 Spider-Man that much. And we've talked about this numerous times over the last, when the game came out, 5 years ago? And I've tried to play it many times, but it just comes back to a central idea of I don't like open world games. I just don't. I don't like the intent. And
Except when
that's
you
the
do.
thing. It comes down to the execution, and that's another great example of me disliking the intent of an experience, but it being executed in a way that I really appreciate. Let me put two of these titles right next to each other, and let's not use the example of Spider-Man. Let's instead use the example of Horizon Zero Dawn and Breath of the Wild, because this really exemplifies my point. I don't like open world games, so on face value, I was already not going to be crazy about Zero Dawn. Now, I also have issues with how it's executed, but for the most part, those funnel back to the idea that the intent of Zero Dawn was to build out an archetypal open world third-person action game with crafting systems and bases to take over and side quests and fog of war and all of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So when I say I don't like those ideas, what I'm really saying is I don't like what Guerrilla Games was going for. In the case of both Guerrilla Games and Sucker Punch, they made exceptional titles in Spider-Man and in Horizon. But I just don't like what they were trying to do. Now, I still have individual issues with some executional things about those games, but really my disconnect is that concept. Breath of the Wild should have been similar because, again, I don't like open world games. But the execution there was all about logical, intuitive design in a way that was very different, not better or worse, but very different than how those other games executed on their intent and their concept. So I think that's another interesting one to draw into conversation, at least to maybe better illustrate what I'm trying to convey.
Yeah. I'm looking at lists right now. I'm trying to pull out some more examples for me, because I think you've actually understood this concept better than I have, even though I think I've probably been thinking.
I'm an empath. I believe we've established that.
You took my own brain cells and you improved upon.
Well, I'm always here's the thing. I'm gonna expose you on camera. You're always letting me in on these little internal conflicts you're having this topic. So I've been subconsciously thinking about this also, I suppose. Yeah.
I'm sure you have. Yeah.
Because you're poisoning me, you son of a bitch. When I visited you in Texas, you were literally poisoning me. I would look over and he'd have this little eye dropper. He's always putting something in my drink, and I'd confront him and I'd say nothing, 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 until I'd stop talking.
It wasn't me. Yeah. That happened.
If you want to think a little bit more, I've got another kind of branch I'd like to talk about too.
Sure, I love branches. I'm a big arbor fan.
Because I also do think, though, that there are 100% unimpeachable examples of good design.
Okay, sure.
And I want to give the example of Z targeting from Ocarina of
Mm.
Time. Z targeting was such a good system that basically every third person action game has adopted it. Only sometimes now
Mm.
you click in the stick to lock onto an enemy instead of holding down Z. You know what I'm saying? There are
Yeah.
definitely examples
Yeah.
of things that games do that are considered good design that are taken as that on
Hmm.
face value that basically no one disagree with. I think it'd be really, really, really hard pressed to find somebody that says that the lock on targeting system is not good design. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
also similar of like on a control level. As soon as FPS studios decided we're going to ADS on left trigger and shoot with right trigger, you're going to find very few people
Yeah.
that say it was bad. That's bad design. Now, I
Hmm.
prefer to play Halo Combat Evolved controls. I want to click on the stick to aim and shoot. But that's not me saying
Mm.
that trigger control is bad because it's very good. So
Yeah.
there are objective instances of game design, but they come back to these such fundamental and small things that,
Hmm.
again, very quickly, shoom, we're off to subjectivity land.
Yeah. So my struggle right now, and something that this conversation has kind of like awoken in me, something that I don't know how I quite feel about yet. And of
Let's
course,
tease
that's
it
what
out.
the point of this
Fuck it.
conversation is what my laying in bed probably until like 3 a.m. tonight, be like, oh, what's going on? Is I'm wondering if there are many games that I think are poorly designed, separate from me disliking
Yeah.
their intent, because a lot of the games that I play a good amount of, that are very popular, that are well received, that I don't personally click with, it's because I don't like that
Yeah.
kind of intent, that type of design that they're going for, that is well done for someone who likes
Yeah.
that kind of game. I don't know how many games I on face value can say are poorly designed in the way that maybe I was thinking I could when I'm coming to this conversation about checkmate.
Right.
Fuck you, Resident Evil and Metroid Prime are badly designed. I don't know
Yeah.
if I can do that. Because I don't think I play enough games that are like Crime Boss, Rocket City, that are broken in terms of the AI, that have textures loading in improperly, that are poorly designed on a mechanical or a technical level. I play mostly games that have a certain bar of quality, or from big corporations that have a lot of QA testing going into things. And so I just don't know. I don't know if my own like thought process is like fully informed, because
Yeah.
I don't play a lot of games that are just come out for $3 on Steam that are like broken and
Well, I mean,
technically
what?
glitchy.
Well, here's the other thing that to me was just trying to
Yeah,
establish like what is objectively good, objectively bad. I think you
yeah,
can look at a game, and I'll give the example of Mario Golf. Uh, what's a new one? Speed
sure.
running around. Speed Golf, Speed Rush, Super
No,
Rush, Mario Golf, Super Rush.
Super Rush. God,
Let's go
yeah,
through the intent and design flowchart here for a second. Concept of Mario
yeah,
Golf on a the most like those two words together, Mario Golf level. I'm already intrigued because I like Mario
yes.
sports games. The intent of that
Hmm.
game was to make golf super fast and action oriented, and I love that
Yeah,
intent. Okay, boom, like the concept, like the intent. Now let's look at execution of design. I think the game is poorly designed at basically every
sure.
twist and turn. They prioritized. I don't even really know what they prioritized. They prioritized making like this half. Well, that's yes.
Story
They
mode,
prioritized
kind
making
of.
like a half baked story mode opposed to just gassing out the multiplayer offerings. They
Yeah,
chose to focus their attention away from the presentation of the title on an art direction level of what like World Tour does of bring in Mario locations. Their
yeah,
execution of this of their intent of fast paced golf doesn't really work for me. They missed so many of the
hmm,
pillars that made me quite disappointed, and it's the games that disappoint me the
yeah,
most are those wherein on the highest level I like what they are. Then I like what they're trying to do,
hmm,
but I hate how they're trying to do it. And that's sort of like the three-tier thing I
yeah,
think you need to go through, because part of my frustration with us talking about Metroid or Resident Evil 1 in the Discord is like that's I
yeah,
think we're attacking the wrong thing. We're bringing subjectivity in at
hmm,
the wrong place. We're bringing subjectivity in at the
Mm-hmm.
point of design. And I think part of the reason why like Bro or Gallows are sometimes bewildered by what we say is because we're saying a game like Resident Evil 1 is badly designed, design being the execution of the intent, when Capcom put every item and camera angle and texture and scripting decision there
Mm-hmm.
because that is exactly the XYZ
Yeah.
coordinate that they
Yeah.
needed it to be at for their measured intent. So that's the thing that I really want to try to reach in this conversation is where should we be attacking games properly? And to me, it's usually the level
Mm-hmm.
of intent. Uh,
Yeah. I I want to try to find an example that I can go as in depth on as you have for some of these, because I do agree that, and as I've just said, that intent is where I
yeah,
end up disagreeing the most with certain games. Actually, an interesting example that came out somewhat recently that I think we can talk a little bit about is the intent of a game like Fireman
sure.
Engage, which is a game that didn't engage either of us. That I wonder if it is the design of the game, the intent of steering away from what Three Houses did and having a lot of really in-depth systems and in terms of socializing
Yeah,
with your teammates and having the focus be on that versus the intent being what Engage did, which is more on just the straight up battles and the mechanicals the mechanical complexity of taking on SRPG battles. And my my disagreement with the intent, I wonder if that in retrospect also applies to people who didn't like
it
Three
definitely
Houses
does.
as much, because that game chose a different design intent for the way that it was approaching its pacing, the world, the characters, the way that you're interacting with them, is setting things in the Garreg Monastery, having things be a little more slow paced, having you walk around to different locations, focus on building things up and building up the relationships in a way that outside of the, unlike the rest of the franchise, had just been click on guy in menu to do
Yeah,
talk with them. And I think the reason that Engage didn't I didn't enjoy it as much, which of course that is different from Three Houses, but is on a design intent and design
yeah,
design level, um, is that I feel like they had succeeded a lot better with Three Houses, and I thought that they were taking the series in a different direction. I thought they had grown past what they had done before of having it be more stripped back and focused on the battles, and learned to, in my opinion, balance a little bit better with the social elements and connecting to the world and the characters, which is what endeared me so much to the franchise. So when they shifted back to the design intent from before, that made it significantly
yeah,
less interesting to me. And in terms of what you said at the very beginning, which is something I've been thinking about in the back of my head this whole time, of comparing it, of course, we want to focus in on what single game basis,
yeah.
on the most micro level that you can get, but then also comparing it to a
Right.
genre or the franchise that it's in, where games like Fire Emblem Engage sit in terms of, is this game poorly designed in certain ways, or is it just that the intent has shifted in a way that I didn't expect or want the design intent to shift or grow over the course of
Yeah,
Fire
I mean,
Emblem games
I
coming
just
out.
pulled it up because Stealth40K on Twitter, who I'm a big fan of, wrote the following: a new Nintendo Dream interview. If people who don't know, Nintendo Dream is like the big official Nintendo publication in Japan. A new Nintendo Dream interview
Mm-hmm.
has revealed new details about Fire Emblem Engage, and he just summarizes them. Developed around the same time as Three Houses, deliberately made to be very
Hmm.
different than Three Houses, planned to be a 30th anniversary
Yeah.
title, but COVID messed up those plans. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting example of that is very squarely an issue with intent. You wanted
Yeah.
them to make a game that they weren't making, and it's very
Mm-hmm.
simple. And there's design issues with Engage beyond that, like the story being fucking dumb, right? And I mean, there's other Fire Emblem
Yeah.
games with this exact same intent with better narratives. I would point to Fire Emblem Awakening as a great
Mm-hmm.
example.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
but you can have both, and just because you don't like a game's intent doesn't mean you can't also take issues with specific mechanical art direction narrative decisions
Mm.
that it make, because of course you can do that. But I
Yeah.
think there's a certain necessity in first establishing, was this game in the first place even going to work for me? Was I going
Mm-hmm.
in excited about what was happening? Was I already skeptical? Did they have to inherently make up ground with me because I wasn't looking for the experience they were offering? There's all those questions that I think have
Yeah.
to first be answered to have really thoughtful conversations then about diagnosing where specific design doesn't work, and then also diagnosing
Hmm.
personally and globally why that doesn't work and how it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I just
Yeah.
think that there's more scales to game design than game
Mm.
design. You got like one sentence concept. You've got the intent of the game. You've got individual. You got like art direction, and you look at big things like big systems and subsystems and various things. You can keep checking. You can
Yeah.
keep checking your way down the list. But to me, that's the important takeaway of a conversation about game design.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've come down on that game design, good game design actually does exist. And a game can be poorly designed or well designed. It depends on if that design matches the intent that the game designers were going for. Is there a disconnect between the way that they wanted the game to make players feel and the mechanics that they ended up layering on top of that, creating the systems of the game? Or do your criticisms come from a difference of that intent? Is it a genre that you're not particularly a fan of? Is it a kind of pacing or a console or an era in time with different design tenets that disconnects you from the way that you're perceiving games, the way that you like to
Yeah.
experience games? And I wonder how much this will shape the way that I approach conversations around games going forward, because I do think that a lot of the quote unquote design intent differences that I have with a lot of people come from different intents that have changed. Intent has changed as well over the course
Yes.
of video game history, alongside of design naturally progressing as consoles have gotten more powerful, as more options, more scales of production have opened up to indie teams and large AAA and quadruple A teams, whatever the hell Microsoft is doing. If intent changing over the course of years, where it seems like a lot of people who are older than me disagree with the design of newer games, I wonder if more that I can meet them on the level of just being a difference in appreciation of intent, of the biggest games coming out nowadays that don't quite gel with what gamers liked 20, 30 years ago, because of course they didn't. If it's just a difference in intent rather than design, because I find myself struggling to justify or working very hard to justify a lot of the games that I like that don't appeal to gamers from a while ago. And I find myself defending them on a design level of no, this actually is designed intentionally with this kind of intent, that I think that they can fairly levy that same praise for the games that I
Yeah.
dislike from their point in time, their point of reference. But I think at the end of the day, these things are similar enough, and experientially, especially similar enough to where making that breakdown is really only useful in this philosophical kind of conversation that you and I are having. Or think about the way that you approach criticizing a game, whether it's good or bad. Does it fit into what you agree with in terms of intent or prefer in terms of intent? But that, don't know where I was going with that, but I
I
think I
did
got
too.
my
I'm
point
out of
across.
points. I think we've circled the water. So you circled. Well,
Drain.
we are circling the drain for sure in our lives.
Yeah. Oh God, it's going down. Watch out.